Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Lee Walton, the Dean of the School of Divinity, and I would like to welcome all of you here today to part one of the Margaret A. Steelman Lecture Series. Our aim here at Wake Divinity is to leverage our lecture series to not only hear from towering figures in the field, but we also seek to create opportunities. To create opportunities for our faculty to enter into productive dialogue regarding their own scholarly work. We have several scholars who work at the intersections of food, faith, health, and ecological well-being here at Wake Divinity. This includes Professor Derek S. Hicks, Associate Professor of Religion and Culture. Professor Hicks's research and teaching interests are in the areas of Black religion and foodways, and he serves as the co-chair of the Religion and Food Group in the American Academy of Religion, our primary professional guild among scholars of religion. Currently, Professor Hicks is working on a book manuscript tentatively entitled Feeding Flesh and Spirit, Religion, Food, and the Saga of Race in Black America. And to engage Professor Hicks today on this topic, we have assembled three extraordinary thinkers and writers on the topics of race, religion, and foodways. First, I would like to introduce Nora Rubel. Dr. Rubel is the Jane and Alan Batkin Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Rochester, where she also serves as the chair of the Department of Religion and Classics. Her areas of expertise include American Judaism, food, and ethnicity. Among her many publications, she co-edited the anthology Religion, Food, and Eating in North America with Columbia University Press. And she's currently at work on a book tentatively entitled Recipes for the Melting Pot, Reading the Settlement Cookbook. Next, to her right, we welcome Kayla Stewart to the campus of Wake Forest University. Kayla is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller Gullah Geechee Home Cooking, Recipes from the Matriarch of Edisto Island. She is a food and travel writer whose work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Bon Appetit, and Condé Nast Traveler. And along with writing about Southern foodways, Kayla Stewart also teaches courses on food and writing at New York University. And our third guest today is Psyche Williams-Forson, Professor and Chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Williams-Forson is a pioneer in the subfield of Black food studies, having authored several books examining the material culture of African Americans through the frames of gender, food, and power. Her most recent book, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, was just published by the University of North Carolina Press. And this book is also why we are so thrilled to have Dr. Williams-Forson as our keynote lecturer this afternoon at 4 p.m. in Wake Chapel. Please receive and welcome our guests with a round of applause. This symposium will last exactly 1 hour. It will begin with Professor Hicks offering a brief 5-minute framing of his book project. Then Professors Williams-Forson, Rubel, and Stewart will provide 10-minute responses to chapter drafts 1, 2, and 3, respectively. We have planned time to allow Professor Hicks a brief response before concluding with 15 minutes of dialogue and potential questions from those of you assembled here. To keep us all on track, I can think of few more capable, credible, and disciplined than our own Professor Corey D.B. Walker. Professor Walker is the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities and the Director of African American Studies here at Wake. And with an extensive record as a scholar of Africana Studies and an administrator at Brown University, Winston-Salem State, and the School of Theology at Virginia Union, Dr. Walker brings grace and gravitas everywhere he goes. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please receive Professor Derek Hicks.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Walton. Thank you to those who have assembled here today. It is interesting to be in the space where you're talking about your own work, but we have assembled such wonderful, wonderful thinkers here today that I just can't wait to get them started. So let me frame the book a little bit for you. Feeding Flesh and Spirit, Religion, Food, and Race in Black America. The soul of this work started actually, as some of you have heard me say, on my grandmother's South Central Los Angeles porch, where she fed the flesh and the spirit of so many who had yet to expunge from their own lives the degradation born out of years of experiencing Jim Crow in the South. Those same folks had experienced the push-pull factors of migrating out of the South and landing in Los Angeles, California, often on my grandmother's porch. Sadie, who was my grandmother, which was my grandmother's name, was from central Louisiana and had come to Los Angeles in 1947. Her method of social disruption was to perform her southern-rooted hospitality through feeding folks her gumbo on the front porch and telling them of a God who sought their full humanity. Now, my practical interest in this subject was lifted out of a first conversation that I had with a dear colleague who is one of our esteemed panelists. I don't know if she recalls, but years ago, Dr. Nora Rubel asked me in an interview a question. It went something like this: what is this gumbo people stuff you're talking about? And I tried to explain it, because at the time I really was using it as a metaphor, but not necessarily thinking in terms of exploring foodways in my work. But that conversation led to me being a part of the co-edited volume that has already been relayed to, and you're hearing Religion, Food, and Eating in North America. So I owe a great debt to my dear colleague, Dr. Nora Rubel. You'll hear me talk about my other wonderful colleague, Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson, and what I owe her later on this afternoon. So Feeding Flesh and Spirit merges the best of what I have elsewhere claimed religion to be for Black folks at its best, which is about orientation in an absurd world, meaning-making, recalibrating of false narratives about the nature of Black life, and the reclamation or extraction of something good that nourishes Black flesh out of the experiences that seek to harm Black flesh. The tale is thus one that says that food and religious faith in African American life shares the work of intentional expression through cultural production that allows Black people to articulate their humanity more fully. The result are vibrant and potent religious and gastronomical languages that African Americans co-create to make the wounded whole. I've chosen to tell this story through 5 dispensations or historical sites in African American life where food and religious faith converge, doing similar work in the lives of those who are doing the cultural production. Each chapter takes on a theme framed around the argument in that particular chapter and starts with a vignette about a significant happening or expression or sight related to my grandmother Sadie's life. And so here's the chapter breakdown. Chapter 1 is entitled The Bible and the Pighead, Origins of Improvisation in the Construction of Black Religion and Black Food. The theme is improvisation. And what I'm lifting here is the agency in the face of the absurd, where enslaved Black people, through their own ingenuity and jazz-like expression, created by way of improvisation a religious life and a culinary culture. My grandmother's kitchen door functions as the theme of the vignette. Chapter 2, Nourishing Debased Flesh, takes on the theme of performance and what African Americans were doing during the Jim Crow era and migration era in cities like Los Angeles, New York, and other northern cities, of performing the South in the North or the West. My grandmother's front porch becomes the theme of the vignette. Chapter 3, The Unusual Feast, Fellowship as Cultural Expression Toward Mobilization, is a theme of cultural kindling or bringing together around the table to mobilize folks during the civil rights era to push back for their freedoms and civil rights granted by the 14th Amendment. My grandmother's table, her dining room table, becomes the site of the vignette theme. Chapter 4, From Detestable to Delicacy, Revitalizing the Black Body Politic, is functioning on a theme of revitalization in the Black Power era. That particular chapter is centering on this idea of Black is beautiful, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, and it centers on the coalescing work of the Black Panther Party's Free Breakfast Program and Fannie Lou Hamer's work in the Mississippi Delta through her farm co-op, both centering on infusing hungry Black bodies with food so that they might be contributors to the advancement of Black life and enhancing the Black body politic, but both also working in coordination with churches. And so my grandmother's home, what my grandmother would articulate as home, becomes the theme of the vignette. And the final chapter, The Hunger Game, not games, the publisher has not yet told me if I can use this, but The Hunger Game, Religious and Culinary Diplomacy While Serving the Public, functions on a theme of cultural recapitulation and really tends to try to articulate ways in which latter-day folks who are doing work of advocacy in communities, which I see one of our dear former students who is doing that work right now through his mobile food pantry. It articulates value of what is already in those communities as a way of being more effective at addressing food insecurity in those communities. And my grandmother's backyard garden becomes the theme of that chapter, or of the chapter's vignette, because she had to remind me, and she's still living, she's 94, she had to remind me a few years ago that she has always been about community gardens because she was growing food long before I was born. So this is the way that the story plays itself out. I am so looking forward to the responses that we will hear today. So without further ado, let us begin with Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hicks. Okay, great, thank you. So as Dr. Hicks has shared, I had the good fortune of reading chapter 1, The Bible and the Pighead, Origins of Improvisational Reclamation in the Production of Black Religion and Food Waste. Mouthful.
That's
That's
a
a mouthful. Okay. Which is a discussion that centers on enslavement in the antebellum period, with the emphasis placed on the social climate giving rise to a style of cultural construction and production of Black religion and culinary culture. So I have these notes, but I'm just going to go ahead and talk this through for a minute. This is really, really good work. It's work that we need in the conversations of African American foodways and religion, but African American foodways more generally, because most of the time we're stuck in the conversation of soul food and the South. And so I'm excited about this project. I can't wait for it to come out, in part because it is filled with material culture. In her landmark, one of her many landmark texts, Zora Neale Hurston, and I'm talking now about Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston has her character Janie tell her pretty much her life story right on the porch. And that by the end of the novel, Janie's friend Phoebe says, you know, I done grew 10 feet tall just from hearing your stories. And why do I bring that up? Because I think you need to go there, because the porch is a symbol and an important, powerful symbol in African American history, life, and culture. We need to explore that a little bit more, I feel. Also, just the whole notion of storytelling. So make more of those two things, right off the bat, because you're telling some powerful stories and you're framing them with your grandmother's life experience, which far too often we don't hear enough about Black women's lives, right outside of what we assume to know and that of the domestic, etc. So say more about that. I understand that this is a text of spirituality and religiosity, and for me, Black women and Black lives embody spirituality and religiosity. So even as you share with us about her life, and you frame it just a little bit more, I'll work with you, let's work together on this, you can pull out so much that we need to know as it relates to food and culture. But what I want to kind of focus on right now is that the chapter, I think, really has three main parts. You identified about 5 things that you're trying to do in the chapter, and I kind of whittled that down to 3. First, I think you're dealing with African American religion, place, space, and agency. Second, I also think that you are talking about an intervention in women's roles with regard to these elements. And then third, immigration in the service of Black cultural production around food. So the first, African American religion, place, space, and agency. I'm really intrigued by Professor Hicks's conversation around his grandmother and grandfather's immigration to LA. And I want him to do more with African American religion and agency. And so for me, I turn to the work of Albert Rabito, right, who of course you know, who maintains, of course, that preachers licensed by the church and hired by the master were supplemented by slave preachers, right? And so if you start with enslavement and you talk about how the porch became symbolic even in that space and the work that it did toward building out spirituality, right? Because so many things happened around the slave cabin. In fact, the archives, and I'm not trying to add too much more work for you, but the archives of John Blatch are right here at UNC right now, and he did quite a bit of work on Black enslaved life, right? And so, and so we'll have a conversation about that. But while his work is important for what it says, he's really clear about Black religious agency, and that's one of the things I didn't necessarily see come through in the chapter. Yes, Black folks were brutalized and dehumanized, but we need more work that speaks to the liberatory agency and how we overcame despite how our ancestors were tormented and dehumanized. And Professor Rabito reminds of this when he speaks to how Black folks had an alternative agenda, always, right? And this includes and exceeds tricksterism to speak to everyday life survival. So I'd like for you to think along these lines. It's okay to talk about the dehumanization, but after a while that's going to eat at your soul. And so I'm suggesting early on that you mention it, but back away from that. And so then I move into your discussion of your grandmother's shrine, and the shrine here being both MLK and Jesus Christ, and the 2 pictures that she has in that kitchen. This is a Black woman you're talking about, and so I need you to do more with that. All right, and her engagement with those particular artifacts of the sacred and the profane. I want to encourage you to look at the work of Kelly Brown Douglas, Walyn Dotson, and Cheryl Jilks, Yvonne Shiro, especially Professor Shiro, because her recent work has shared on how Black women expand upon the definitions of Black spiritualism. And this is a key component of what you're talking about in this chapter, right? And so here's where I'm going to push the envelope a little bit. In an article that was mentioning Dr. Sherrill, she talks about how Black women embrace the spiritual realm today. And that is things that Christianity has told us are wrong, the occult, right? The mysticism, holy water, anointing oil. And I encourage you to go back to your grandmother's kitchen and look around. Do you see crystals? Do you see rocks? Do you see plants? Do you see these other accoutrements that speak to who she is as this spiritual being, imparting both the physical and feeding the flesh, but also imparting the spirit simply by the very presence of those objects. I also want to encourage you to think about the kitchen as a place of cultural deliverance, as well as religious and cultural transmission, which is very key for women in general, Black women in particular, because it speaks of social and community agency, activism and liberation, as you mentioned. Food and food spaces are a conduit, right, for this transmission. So regardless of if Big Mama was making smothered pork chops or lemon ginger and cayenne, as Sherrill rightly explains, African American religion, I'm quoting now from Sherrill, African American religion was characterized by diversity from the start. Scattered references to the activities of sorcerers, doctors, conjurers from the 1700s and early 1800s indicate that Black religious beliefs were multifaceted. And in that multifacetedness, you see the gumbo, right? Because you're talking about these present elements, but also these nicely, richly gathered elements that come together. So then African spirituality recognized the roles of individuals who were sacred practitioners, diviners, healers, dynamic intermediaries between realms. And I would like to encourage you to make more of that to show the diversity of Black religiosity. While you look at the work of Todd Savitt in his talk of medicinals and Sam Hilliard around pork, I also want to push you to look at the work of archaeologists Ann Yench, Charlotte Fett, who's a historian, Jessica Harris, and Fred Opie, right? Because collectively they speak of West African traditions that landed in the New World, herbalism and root cures led by African and African American women, and the roles of so many foods in the migration process. Though not all mention or even directly relate to religion and spirituality, the background information will better contextualize, I think, your arguments. From meals and elixirs to balms, this is women's work in the healing of the body, the mind, and the soul, and so it directly speaks to the gumbo that you're talking about. Finally, I want to encourage you and circle back as I started with Zora Neale Hurston. I want to also encourage you to take a look at Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, right? Because among other texts, what Dash deals with is healing traumas, right, in Black life. And this is a critical, important trope that you speak about, but you don't name. And the atrocities that you describe cannot be understated at all, but I don't want to leave them in the space that you do right now. I want to move beyond those spaces of trauma to talk about the ways in which Black women do healing work through food and feeding, right? In her 2019 book, Darkly, Darkly, Black History in America's Gothic Soul, Layla Taylor speaks of the violence and dehumanization Black people endured during slavery and segregation and the ways it has haunted us, right? The haunting, right, that Avery Gordon talks about. And she speaks to the ways that it has influenced our music, literature, and other cultural artifacts. Beloved is another book text that you might consider. But specifically, as I close out, in Dash's Daughters of the Dust, we see all of these elements come together: games, storytelling, basket making, all of it in conjunction with food. We also see memory and ritual tied in there together, right? And so I would like to see you make this chapter as multifaceted as the gumbo about which you speak, and bring into the conversation some of these more dynamic scholars or more nuanced, scholars who are more nuanced than, say, Hilliard, which is nothing wrong with his work, but it's a little dated. and Savitt to move toward folks like Charlotte Fett who are talking about the role of Black women. And so I will end there. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for including me in this on this wonderful panel. And I just had to cross out a bunch in my introduction that was about that echoes our first conversation, Professor Hicks. We met, it was at least 12 or 13 years ago, back when we were baby professors. And he did talk about gumbo, and my spidey sense went off. And so, but I want to thank you for thinking more about this gumbo and this grandmother. And while I've only read the In Progress Chapter 2, I am very much looking forward to reading more. So this chapter, also a mouthful, Nourishing Debated Flesh, the Performance of Religion and Food to Make the Wounded Whole, introduces Dr. Hicks's concept of Black religio gastronomy. And it gave me a lot to think on. While we work on different populations, our time periods of study are similar, and I feel some parallels between this project and my own work, particularly in Dr. Hicks's highlighting of migration, nourishment, and performance, and particularly dealing with a certain politics of respectability. I think anyone who pays attention to migration or immigration patterns, race and ethnicity, you can't help but notice food as both a driving and defining force. And as someone who thinks about Black religion and food quite a bit, I was quite stunned. I was trying to think of other works to place this aside, to realize that there really is no full-length treatment of this subject yet. So there are, of course, historical and anthropological works on African American foodways, but not that center on religion. And there are works on Black religion that address food, particularly in sectarian movements, but again, they are not about Black religion and food. Judith Weisenfeld's New World A Coming, I think does a good job of including it, but I like where you're going with this. Michael Twitty's recently published Kosher Soul, The Faith and Food Journey of an African American Jew might come close, but again, that's more of an autobiographical piece and it's more contemporary. So Dr. Hicks, in addition to sharing this tremendous scholarship with us, is also doing something both new and necessary for the field. Building upon work in other disciplines that address Black foodways, Derek introduces Black religio gastronomy as a way of understanding the spiritual foodways that emerge as a result of the trauma of slavery, the failures of Reconstruction, and the hopes and hardships of migration. As Hicks writes in his chapter, I soon realized that little has been done to formally link Black religious studies to Black foodways, and a foodways studies refers to a set of beliefs and practices that govern culinary expression and consumption, then perhaps we can learn something about the nature of Black social activism and religious self-disclosure through food. It's not a surprise that food and religion are linked in this way. Food appears throughout religious art, poetry, and liturgy. As Carolyn Walker Bynum demonstrates, sin had entered the world when Eve ate the forbidden fruit, and salvation comes when Christians eat their God in the ritual of the communion table. Da Vinci's image of Jesus dining with his disciples in the Last Supper is one of the most famous paintings in history, and I actually do have to say that some of the imagery of the front porch kind of gave me this sort of table feeling of the Last Supper. And many Christians continue to reenact that graceful meal weekly, some with wafers and wine, some with Wonder Bread and Welch's grape juice. But sometimes food is neither a metaphor nor a symbol. Sometimes it is, in fact, just food. So in addition to being central at congregational potlucks, food functions practically within religious groups for fundraisers such as the spaghetti dinners of Italian American Catholic parishes and the Nation of Islam's famous bean pies, or as outreach, as the students probably know, such as pizza at campus ministries. So religious foodways, therefore, both reflect and inform religious meaning and practice, and thus provide material evidence for scholars of religion, such as the gumbo that you've written so beautifully about. In this chapter, Hicks provides us with a history of post-slavery hopes and disappointments from the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. This is actually a pretty long stretch, and it comes off of, and I know that some of the flow is going to change. And after writing so beautifully about Sadie and her porch and performance, I kind of missed her. So I'm wondering, perhaps if you can weave in more to, not necessarily about her, but I guess I'm echoing Dr. Williams-Forson saying I'd like to see a little bit more about women and their experiences during this. It's all really, really good information. I just want to see a little bit more of a through line. Let's see. The failures of Reconstruction and the debasement that Black Americans continued to face set the stage for migration both north and west. Hicks notes political imagery depicting African Americans as vampires and other sorts of menacing beasts, specifically addressing an 1898 cartoon called The Vampire That Hovers Over North Carolina. With a look of part glee and part insatiable rage, this beast is shown to be attempting to pluck away all of the white men with its terrible claws. The remaining white virtuous women, it is implied, will be left behind to fend for themselves in the face of what undoubtedly will be a sexual threat. The beast emerges in the air with wings. Written within each wing are words that undoubtedly convey the ultimate message of the cartoon, Negro rule. I couldn't help but be struck by these images, and I see Dr. Lynn Neal in the audience, who has also done a lot of work on imagery of religious intolerance. So her work came to mind. And also there are similar histories of Jews, even at this exact time, being depicted as vampires and predatory beasts, always ready to rape white Gentile women. And I would also note that these images are specifically of men, Black and Jewish men, so that women are depicted quite differently. And in any case, this imagery that depicted African Americans as you write, standing at the ready to kill, rape, and destroy, made being a Black man unsafe in most places. But to leave the old world always requires adjustment, even when remaining is impossible, as it was for many Southern Blacks. As Hicks writes, thus their cultural toolkit needed to be expanded to encompass the unforeseen realities of singing, praising, and eating in a new land. This migration allowed for a reshaping of meaning-making and a Christian emphasis on the Bible, the bath, and the broom, all meant to both comfort as well as correct disparaging stereotypes about Black people. One of the things that this section made me think about is Deborah Dash Moore's To the Golden Cities. I don't know if you have encountered that, but it's about Jews leaving kind of the eastern coastal cities and moving both south and west. Brought by, I think what she called the 3 A's, the Army, airplanes, and air conditioning. But it's a story where you might find some parallels in this idea of, kind of trying to preserve the old world, which is in your case again, it's not Africa, and it's not Africa for Black people, it's not Europe for Jews, it's the South for Black people, and it's New York, Brooklyn for Jews. And how do you transport these new foodways, these cultural touchstones to these new lands? Okay, so this comfort took shape in multiple ways. Dr. Hicks describes it as nourishment and offers the example of Father Divine's peace mission. And this is I love this section. A radical new thought movement that was famous for its massive feasts and seemingly unlimited amounts of food. Hicks writes, "For Father Divine, rotund parishioners signaled to a struggling society the power of Divine's work in his ministry. Indeed, Divine did encourage plumpness as an external sign of God's love. We could contrast this embrace of weight gain with the Nation of Islam, a contemporaneous movement that encouraged thinness, fasting, and an opposition to the traditional soul food diet offered at the Peace Mission. Elijah Muhammad's How to Eat to Live offers a diet that rejects pork, the ubiquitous hog, as well as other traditional black Southern foods. By the 1960s and 70s, and this may be covered in a later chapter, while Amiri Baraka embraces the soul food diet as culturally symbolic of the movement, we see other black religious groups, such as Hebrew Israelites and MOVE, adopt a naturalist diet. In the case of the Hebrew Israelites, a vegan diet. Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, similarly advocated for a natural African diet, and in later years, even Mother Divine advocated a turn toward a macrobiotic diet, signaling a shift from nourishing, quote unquote, to quote unquote healthy food. And these are some of the people that Fred Opie writes about as food rebels. So one thing you don't mention, and I would love to see, is the celibacy required of Divine's congregants in the Peace Mission. Like, note this celibacy. Divine is policing appetites, both gastronomical and sexual. And so in this way, both the Peace Mission and the Nation of Islam, which was also notoriously kind of prudish on sex, are practicing politics of respectability, policing one's own community by sometimes the standards of others, by adapting and adopting foodways and appetites. It seems obvious to say that there are insider and outsider foods, and today as we talk about black food, we note that there are insider and outsider foods within this category as well, whether those boundaries are formed due to differing religious affiliation or regional context, and that much of the variety of traditional foodways rests on a sort of agreed upon group performance. As Dr. Hicks writes, Black religio-gastronomy entails a remembering of material and metaphorical bodies within the African American community and pushes them toward active self-preservation. Performance gives these cultural practices not just a means of expression, but also the nuance of complex cultural systems. And of course, we cannot speak of performance without speaking of Sadie, the great Mama Dean, and the transformative nature of her religio-culinary porch sessions. You write of her forming a zone of blackness that is a contribution of transmitted spirit and culinary expression as binding cultural productions. It's really, you know that what's happening on the porch is southern, northern, urban, rural, West African American, orally disseminated, sacred, textually driven, articulated through spirituals, while being blues infused with jazz articulation. Thus, place of the religious or sacred need not be bound by time or geography. It is influenced by both. I love this. And I think also, one of the things that struck me is that this porch is a third space for a lot of people. And I would sort of emphasize that as this is not your home, this is not your work, but this is another space that is fulfilling and feeds you in both gastronomically and spiritually. And I am absolutely running out of time. But I just want to offer a question. You note that these reapplied cultural productions are considered invaluable in sustaining Black migrants who transitioned but never socially left the South behind. So Mama Dean is offering a performance. And what I'd like you to think about is, are those that are there with Mama Dean performing as well? So what is, we had some dinner last night and we talked about collard greens and okra, and we discussed the matter of acquired taste, right? So one's probably not born loving gumbo. and or greens, as we discussed. But acquires that taste and therefore begins to equate it with nostalgia and love and family or place. So is the nourishment that Mama Dean is providing a way for those consuming it to perform blackness, a type of blackness, a southernness? So I would just, and it made me think of the food writer M.F.K. Fisher, who once wrote, "There is a communion of more than our bodies when bread is broken and wine drunk." We might say the same about Mama Dean's gumbo. As we examine the production, preparation, and consumption of food by religious peoples, we have an access point in understanding ways of meaning and construction of identity. Thank you for
Okay. Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Hicks, for having me. I am surrounded by people I'm inspired by in my own career and who I've referenced, so it's a pleasure and honor to be up here with these folks. Dr. Hicks, I am reviewing chapter 4, From Detestable to Delicacy, Revitalizing the Black Body Politic Through Religion and Food. There's an enduring sort of grounding connection between Black food and Black religion. In West Africa, events that are often connected to a religious institution or following, such as weddings or funeral, nearly always play host to a large meal. Rice, soups, and stews are often served as a form of celebration or to comfort grief. In countries like Senegal, Tunisia, and Mali, the Islamic tradition Eid al-Adha is where Muslim Africans get to enjoy a grand feast. Typically, this includes some sort of meat like cow, goat, or lamb, or in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, sheep, camel, or ox, which is available there. These are often served with sauce, rice, yams or eggplant, salads, and of course, soups and stews. When Africans were kidnapped and displaced around the world during the transatlantic slave trade, they carried their food and their religion with them. I say this because food and religion have long existed in tandem in the Black diaspora. The result of which we now see in Black churches and mosques. We see them in synagogues where Black Jews worship, and African religious institutions across the Americas. We see it in Europe and in other places where Black people have created what Dr. Hicks has described as home. In Dr. Hicks's provocative chapter, From Detestable to Delicacy, readers are introduced to a body politic sustained by humanizing experiences, food, and spirituality. As I imagine he has throughout the book, based on what I've heard already, he does a tremendous job of inviting us into his grandmother Sadie's world. Dr. Hicks's grandmother transports readers to an era that produced some of the most significant Black television, The Jeffersons, What's Happening in Good Times, or shows that through various depictions of class, gender, and identity, demanded that Black Americans be viewed as full, complex, and whole human beings. Before I interrogate this intersection of food and religion and Black culture, Dr. Hicks implores us to consider the era of the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans left the South to pursue safety and opportunity in the Northwest, Midwest, and West. His grandmother, of course, was one of these migrants, and he tells us, for Sadie, uplifting a Black body politic meant doing the work of recapturing the values and experiences of home, Louisiana, even within the context of her house in Los Angeles. Evidence of said work almost immediately begins with the presentation of Black food. He describes the Colfax Club, which was a place where Black migrants in LA could share their stories, their hopes, and their dreams. We know that similar clubs like this existed across the United States, and I would love to see more examples of said social experiences that I would argue were also just safe spaces for Black people to gather and be themselves. Surrounded by others who came from the South, the Colfax Club was nearly always centered around a meal. He describes the Los Angeles take on the iconic fish fry, which he describes as complete with blues, women dancing joyously, and stories being exchanged about life back home. And Dr. Hicks, I'll come back to this later, but I would add that what I would love to see, particularly in this section, is why the fish fry is so important to Black people. And I'd encourage you to reference a piece in the New York Times by Portia Wilson, who's a fantastic writer. It is the late summer tradition of the fish fry in Black America, which also includes a lot of work from various scholars that you might want to refer to. He also described occasionally lavish spreads, which included a meal of catfish, buffalo fish, hot water cornbread, cabbage or greens, and sometimes both, neck bones, fried chicken, and 7-Up cake. As these members recalled painful memories about living in the Jim Crow South, they were also declaring an unabashed determination to lead a full, unapologetic Black life, surrounded by Black food. They passed around Louisiana hot sauce and bottles of pepper sauce. As he notes, the peppers were visible in said sauce. The chance to commingle in a shared, one might say, safe space provided an opportunity for self-articulation, a necessary act that allows us to preserve and maintain one's full humanity. The Coal Flax Club was central to Sadie's life, but like many Black men and women, so too was her church. Sadie sought spirituality and solace at El Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, and Dr. Hicks makes a pointed argument, both intentionally and unintentionally, the Great Migration created differing understandings of the church's function for Black people, those being transformation and recreation. Fellowship at church in Los Angeles and throughout Black churches across the United States revolved around food. Southern Black transplants articulated the idea of home through urban churches, prayer meetings, dining halls, fellowship suppers, fish fries, chicken dinners, and barbecue plates. But as many realize, the respectability politics were more of a hindrance than an advancement, and as Black identity evolves, so too does the connection between religion and food in Black communities. I would love to see more of either Sadie or the women in the Black churches that were also commanding food and allowing for these connections. And I'm talking about the barbecue plate dinners, the spaghetti and catfish that were sold to support community efforts and initiatives, the chili hot dogs during Vacation Bible School, all of these places where children or adults could come for their spiritual fulfillment, but also to get a meal and to feel safe and loved in a community space that was largely not only developed, but carried on by Black women. We then take a turn to a chilling yet necessary reflection of the Black body as food. He outlines devastating examples of the enslaved being licked by slave owners at slave markets and imagery depicting Black people as food. Dr. Hicks tells us in detail the repercussions of the Black body being viewed as a commodity, as something to be used, consumed, and destroyed. He cites Kayla Tompkins, which is excellent, her work in racial indigestion. Readers are forced to understand yet another disturbing component of American racism, the proliferation of imagery that depicts Black bodies as food, as consumable, as lesser than human during the antebellum period. Importantly, and I think smartly, you don't linger on that point. I think it can get potentially uncomfortable for readers, but it invites us to explore what your core mission of in this chapter is, which is the Black Panther and their successful breakfast program for Black youth. I do want to see more of a connection between the two. I would love to see a clear, more direct line between those two conversations. I think they're both important, but I think it could be expressed more, how they connect with one another. Here we learn about the Black Panther Party, which many of us are familiar with, but their successful breakfast program, and the tensions that between the Black Panther Party and the church. The Black Panther Party believed that starvation was one of the most primal, devastating, and obvious attacks against Black people, particularly Black children, in a prominent way to strip Black children of their humanity. After launching this free breakfast program during the late 1960s in California, the program had become so successful in the 1970s that it took off in other states. Many of us know the story from here. The Black Panthers' resounding success threatened the United States and what they understood as what Black people should be. And FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the counterpol tactics to target them. During this time, Black churches, in some ways, still abiding by respectability politics, were resistant to this form of activism. And many in the party were open about their frustration, and many in the Black Panther Party were open about their frustrations with the church. I think it's very important that we talk about this tension, albeit uncomfortable, because it shows the many different ways that people perceive their Blackness. Here, Hicks notes that the Black Panther Party called out what they deemed as hypocritical pastors trying to derail the program, and lamented that several pastors refused to answer letters or even meet with representatives about the program. One unnamed preacher told his congregation that the Black Panthers were communist. Many in the Black Panther Party, however, grew up in the Black church, like many Black people who were from the South, and they knew of its significance in communities, and thus forged ahead with trying to connect with local churches. I love that this part is here, and I love that we get to explore this tension, but I also would love to see examples of where food and religion worked out, where there weren't tensions, and where Black churches and or chefs and or home cooks, many of whom were Black women, were able to use food and religion in a successful, kind of cohesive, amicable way. This work is in progress, but it's already articulating especially important description of Black American life. In addition to some of the edits and inclusions Dr. Hicks indicates that he plans to add, such as land ownership, grassroots activism, and references to Fannie Lou Hamer's work in the Mississippi Delta, I'm also eager to see references to commonalities across the diaspora that further demonstrate how and why religion and food continue to be so deeply interwoven. Examples of this, from Black Americans in the Nation of Islam who found a common language over dishes like the bean pie in New York, to the Bahian people who prepare and indulge in dishes like a karajé, which is a shrimp-stuffed black-eyed pea fritter prepared and created in reference for candomblé, an African diasporic religion that's most readily on display in Brazil and is actually set to honor Black women. If you go to Brazil, you'll see these women, they're the only ones that are allowed to sell this food. Importantly, I would also encourage a deep reflection into the food being served and why those dishes were so important. Put another way, circling back to Dr. Hicks's title, From Detestable to Delicacy, I want a more direct explanation as to what these delicacies are and why. For example, I'd be eager to see language as to why the African American fish fry was so important to the community, of course, and eager to understand the significance of dishes like collard greens, particularly for those who are reading who don't know those things. And the long-standing history of barbecue plates and spaghetti and catfish plates being served as Black churches, often to fundraise for local community efforts. You do an outstanding job of citing diverse scholars, particularly with regard to gender. However, in a chapter so closely dedicated about food, I would love to also see more work from Black food scholars. There are many of them. I'd particularly suggest talking to Adrian Miller, because Adrian has done a tremendous amount of work around food and religion, and he understands kind of the nuances of that conversation. He holds extensive knowledge about that intersection, as well as Dr. Monica White, who I know Dr. Williams-Forson knows and suggested to me, who can also speak to Fannie Lou Hamer's work and contextualize her work on self-sufficiency. I'd also love to see and would suggest including more vivid details of food and more vivid examples of people eating food. For example, if possible, I would love to see either reports or reflections from a child who recalls eating breakfast in the BPP program. What did that mean to them? I would imagine that child should be, 40s, 50s, 60s. These are people who are still alive. We can get those stories and hear why this was so important to the people that were being served. I would also love to understand more and see more writing about the greater understanding and significance to Black food as it pertains to Black survival, but specifically also to Black joy and humanity. There's a humanness about a plate of food being prepared for you that is of your culture, that is of your people, that is prepared for you and carrying the ingredients and flavors and seasonings that are of your society. How does food and spirituality allow us to preserve and transform our traditions, fitting our ever-evolving presentations of Blackness? I'm eager to continue examining these excellent questions that you're raising, Dr. Hicks, and the findings that emerge from your research.
Let me start by saying thank you to each of you for critically engaging this text copiously, closely. As you all may have heard, these chapters are unfinished. They are still works in progress, and poor Sister Stewart had to endure the most unfinished of the chapters. And yet, what I love is the way in which each of them brought out some commonalities that I really need to press further, and that is, one of my questions to each was the kind of flavoring, use, impact, expansiveness or lack of expansiveness from one chapter to the other of the vignettes, and how I'm telling Sadie's story. And each of them said, tell more of it or tell more storyline related to it, even if it isn't directly related to Sadie. And what you all don't know is what I do in each one is I tell the vignette and then I jump into the chapter, the rest of the chapter, without referencing Sadie anymore, or at least referencing Sadie much, with the intention of articulating some of the thematic flavoring that I do in the vignette. So very, very important in me hearing how this is being responded to. In terms of Dr. Williams-Forson, you all have got to know that we have these types of conversations. They're not really conversations. I listen more, and Dr. Williams-Forson speaks. And part of this chapter, as I was telling Dr. Rubel and Stewart last night, is the framing of this chapter, the debt that I owe to the framing of the chapter as is to Dr. Williams-Forson, who some years ago said to me, you know, brother, I would like for us to think less about black folks, quote, making do, end quote. Remember that conversation? And more about what they actually did in the construction. And so that completely shifted and made a lot longer and still yet more work to do, the chapter emphasis, from making do of scraps toward improvisation and brilliance. And so Dr. Williams-Forson's signaling of scholars who I've liberally used in Yvonne Charoux and her work in Black Magic and other work, and Charlotte Fett's work in Cures, which I had to realize, I'm like, Charlotte Fett ain't in there? And if Charlotte Fett isn't, Charlotte Fett will be, because those are, in fact, the types of works that I have viewed in relationship to the type of things that I'm describing my grandmother doing on those porches. So that's going to be utterly important to really go back and fine-tune. Dash's Daughters in the Dust is something that I've engaged but not really extracted and applied to my work, and so I'm looking forward to doing that as well. Moving to Dr. Rubel, and this kind of, it's always interesting to hear how people respond to the themes that you are promoting in a given chapter and what kind of jumps to the fore for them, and the politics of respectability jumps to the fore, and my use of sisters like Nannie Helen Burroughs to think critically about what's happening in this moment where African Americans are realizing the extent to which they feel the need to migrate out of the South to other places and perform the South in those places. And so I'm very much appreciative of the suggestion of Deborah Dash Moore's work, which was spot on, and really doing a little bit more with Kwame Ture's later thought. Stokely Carmichael is the one often credited with first stating audibly and publicly, "We want Black power," right with Martin Luther King in the Mississippi Delta, where Martin Luther King himself was a little gun-shy about saying black and power in the same sentence, but by the end of their time, King is also saying, we need more power. So exploring that fully further and really excavating a little bit more from Divine's policing of sexual appetites amongst the fold as a way to expand this narrative about politics of respectability in this moment of performance in other spaces, which of course Divine is looking at, is dealing with folks from the South, but in the North, was also really good. And so I'm also appreciative of Dr. Rubel's push for extracting a bit more out of Sadie's performance, and how nourishment provided a way to give new platforms for Blackness. Finally, Dr. Stewart, and you know, there are several things that, and I know I'm running out of time here because we want to get 15 minutes, but Adrian Miller's work, Monica White's work, and others are works that are on the docket for this chapter already, and pieces that have not been developed. I had a conversation with Adrian Miller several years ago on this very subject, and we you know, that was back right when the book had come out, so he would still respond to email. Not no more, but there was enough there that allowed me to really draw upon his thinking that undergirded some of the work. So I appreciate kind of being reminded of that and going back to it. But most importantly, this notion of Black joy, which is on my mind as I'm writing, but I get into these modes of really wanting to, you know, I'm very, as my students will attest to, I'm a very contextual thinker. I want what is happening within the context, and the context here is the absurd. And so I spend a lot of time on the context, and then spend the next set of time on the responses to that context, and realize I've got to more fully flesh out those responses as not just being critical and practical, but responses that include joy. And so I'm appreciative of being reminded of that as well. And so I'm going to stop right there and open the floor up for our last 13 minutes for some conversation. So thank you all so much.
We got some time. Sue has some wonderful.
Oh, we were supposed to only go an hour. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about my class time, which ends at 1:45. So maybe we got 10 minutes for it.
Anybody got a question?
You got to catch it.
All right.
And you speak it to
Awesome. So I'm Terry Brock. I'm an archaeologist. So I have archaeology questions or comments, whichever you prefer. First, Dr. Williams-Forson did mention some archaeologists that could be helpful for the work. I'm curious if you're engaging with archaeological work at all in your piece, and then if I have some suggestions also about places to look.
Yeah, so the first chapter especially, I'm wanting to excavate more. I will admit that chapter has ballooned to close to 78 pages right now, and so there's going to be a lot of work that I'm going to have to do to ratchet some portions down to infuse it with some other things. But I'm hearing both of you clearly on that, and luckily I have you as a resource.
Exactly, you absolutely do. There's a lot of wonderful archaeological work that goes into a lot of the themes that I was hearing, particularly in the first chapter, but space and place is very much something that archaeologists are exploring within the context of the plantation. Whitney Battle-Baptiste's work, Black feminist archaeology, Sweeping Spirits, is a lot of her work that archaeologists are doing is exploring the extension of the home space, right, the home place, into the yards.
Right.
And her work actually talks about sweeping the spirits away, right, the bad spirits away to create a space in front of the home. And I often think about swept yards in slightly more of a practical standpoint, but you can also see food production happening in yards, barbecue trenches and things like that. So that interplay of clearing a space, cleansing it, right, spiritually, and then producing food in that space, and building family and community and all of those things, I think would be really, really interesting intersection to look at.
Yeah, Terry, that's really good because it also allows the conversation to be more nuanced in a way that does not center it solely around the hearth and what's happening there, right?
It's an interplay of all these different spaces, and you see what you see a lot, and archaeologists have seen a lot is, you have multiple dwellings, right? Homes, but the cooking is communal, right? And the yard, similar to the porch. I love that idea of it as a third space. I'm borrowing that. I love that. But it's thinking about the yard as an extension of the home in the same way that the porch is, and moving into the yard, archaeology shows that very clearly everywhere. And then also like plates and bowls and fauna material and things like that are going to inform the types of food where they're getting food. So from that improvisation standpoint, where you're seeing, and we do in the archaeology, the use of wild game, right, fish, frogs, I mean everything, you know, what they can get their hands on, right, in addition to what they're being given and what they're raising, what they're growing.
That's good stuff.
Moving from, I also love that idea, making do to what they did, right? So taking what you have and then turning it into something special.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Anyway, looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you, brother.
Anyone?
Yeah.
No, keep going.
Sorry.
I was still crystallizing. Hi, I'm Malcolm Seals. I'm a student of Professor Hicks, or Dr. Hicks, in his class right now on evangelicalism in North America. Very riveting. But I wonder if you could speak to and expound more on the connection you are trying to make between gastronomy and Black improvisation, and how Black gastronomy and improvisation and Black improvisation in music, and how and if you see those two as related, and if those will show up, and if you'll speak to the connection between those two in your work.
Does your partner to the right want to add something? Because that's a question right up his alley.
It's coming.
Yeah. So what I will say is there is not necessarily a direct link where I'm excavating a lot about music as a cultural production. And of course, I'm speaking in terms of cultural productions generally, right? So religion as a cultural production, food or culinary culture as a cultural production, and music, of course, functions itself as a cultural production. But I am speaking to the interplay, right, between these cultural productions where Black improvisation and agency, even in the face of the absurd, is being shot through what is produced. And that African Americans are co-creating these things, even as what they are creating is kind of feeding them, literally in terms of food, spiritually in terms of the religion, but also kind of at the soul level in terms of its nuance and jazz-like expression, which of course is taken from the music itself. So yes, there is interplay, but it may not be as pronounced. I think there was a question back.
Yeah, Shannon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Is this thing on? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for a fantastic panel. My question has to do with some of what I heard across the board about the inclusion of your grandmother's story in the chapters proper. And my question is kind of twofold. First, without any consideration, if possible, of the exigencies professionally, who are you writing to? Who's your imagined audience? And in what ways do traditions of Black self-writing show up in your imagination as you structure the vignettes and think about them in relation to the chapters proper?
Great question. So it's important to note that the structure of this book did not initially include the vignettes. I wrote a portion of the book. This is a cautionary tale that I'm about to tell. Some folk know this. But I lost the entire book when my hard drive crashed on my previous laptop. And it couldn't be uncovered. And I started rewriting the book just from memory. I just tried to do it that way first. And then I realized the extent to which portions of my grandmother's story really lended themselves to what I was trying to do in the book. And I by then I'd read and had at least one exchange with Jessica Harris, who infuses some of her work with story, and I decided, and I'd been tutored by building houses out of chicken legs, which is written in the type of prose I wanted to go toward. And so that's when the vignettes, which were intended to be really short, but did not end up that way, came to the fore. So my intended audience then shifted, right? So it went from this kind of purely academic text, or at least mostly academic text, that would be published by a university press, to the type of book that I thought a broader audience would be interested in. And so it is academics, it is students, but it is also the laity that I'm hoping that the vignettes and kind of weaving that storyline in will change. But now having read some of Dr. Williams-Forson's new book, Reading While Black, and organizing a panel discussion next week at AAR around that. What I'm also being impacted by is the way in which Dr. Williams-Forson is functioning in that book as a kind of provocateur, and part of that means a certain weaving of narrative that appeals to a more broad audience. And so I'm trying to kind of excavate that prose myself in this text. And so, from what I'm hearing here and a bit of what you're shadowing as well, that narrative from the vignettes needs to be in some way, even if it isn't named Sadie, woven throughout the chapters, which I'm excited about exploring. Thank you.
We're gonna do one last quick. Okay.
I'll try to make it quick, Doc. So there's some discussion around bodies, and particularly the debasing of the black bodies, particularly in slavery, and even, I'm sure, some discussion about kind of this cannibalistic view of the black body during that time. But there are several scholars who have done some work around particularly black bodies reclaiming wholeness in the Eucharist and table narrative. So I'm interested, I think, in a way about how might Eucharistic theology and some of those conversations play into how this continues to develop. But more so, how do you see this possibly influencing our conversations around black bodies and the table?
Yeah. Seems like we've had this conversation in my culinary culture class years ago, and while at this point there's another piece that will deal with the Eucharist that is likely going to be a preliminary chapter. So right now the book is constructed around 5 chapters, but there's a 6th out there that will allow me to cut the first chapter that Dr. Williams-Forson had to read down some, and the Eucharist is planned to be in that. But what I love about your question is, how do we think about that? Because we tend to think about the Eucharist, and unfortunately, oftentimes we think of the Nordic Jesus when we're thinking about the Eucharist, right? And so what does it mean to kind of turn that narrative and to rethink the Eucharist around the value, the beauty, and the nature of being encased in black flesh is something that I think I'm hearing more and willing to explore more. I haven't done it fully yet, but that is likely going to be a part of the first chapter.
First of all, please join me in thanking Dr. Hicks. Thank you, Professor Hicks. We know that for multiple audiences, that this contribution, this intellectual contribution will be a gift. We are thankful for it. And we also know that this gift now has been and will continue to be enriched by these wonderful conversation partners, Professor Williams-Forson, Professor Stewart, and Professor Rubel. Thank you for joining us today.